Think you could handle life in the Wild West? You wouldn't last 24 hours. Modern comforts have made us soft, and what frontier people dealt with daily would shock you to your core. Let's talk about Wild West food, the stuff that would have you running back to the 21st century faster than you can say McDonald's. First off, forget everything you've seen in movies about cowboys eating beans around campfires and enjoying saloon steaks. For regular folks, meals were dangerous, disgusting, and often deadly. Most people ate a diet that was about as safe as playing Russian roulette with your stomach. Trail hands and settlers lived mainly on hardtack, salt pork, and beans cooked in rancid bacon grease. Hardtack was basically a brick of flour and water baked until it was hard enough to break your teeth. Cowboys called it sheet iron biscuits or tooth dullers. Here's a terrifying fact. Most hardtack was infested with weevils and maggots. The standard practice was to tap your hardtack against the table to knock out the bugs before eating. If you were eating in the dark, you just crunched through them and hoped for extra protein. Some cowboys would dunk their hardtack in coffee to soften it and drown the bugs at the same time. The ones that floated to the top you'd skim off. The ones that didn't, well, you just swallowed them down. Meat was even worse. There was no refrigeration, so meat spoiled within hours in the desert heat. Salt pork was the main protein source, and it was exactly what it sounds like. Pork packed in so much salt it could last for months. The salt content was so high it would make your blood pressure spike just looking at it. Before cooking, you had to soak salt pork in water for hours to make it edible. Even then, it tasted like salty leather and gave you a thirst that couldn't be quenched. Fresh meat meant you just killed something, and you had to eat it fast before it rotted. Cattle drives would occasionally slaughter a steer, but in summer heat. That meat would start turning green within a day. Cowboys would cut away the rotten parts and eat what was left. Food poisoning was so common it was just considered part of life. If you weren't suffering from dysentery or stomach cramps, you were the exception, not the rule. Beans were eaten at almost every meal because they were cheap and didn't spoil. But these weren't the canned beans we eat today. These were dried beans that had to be soaked overnight and cooked for hours. Trail cooks would make a pot of beans that lasted for days, adding water and more beans as needed. By day 3, that pot of beans was a bacterial nightmare. The joke was that beans gave you gas, but the real problem was they gave you diseases that could kill you. Water was the biggest killer of all. Most water sources in the West were contaminated with animal waste, human waste, or both. Rivers that looked clean were often filled with bacteria that would have you dying of cholera within days. Cholera was so common in frontier towns that it killed thousands every year. You'd start with stomach cramps, then violent diarrhea and vomiting, and within 24 hours you'd be dead from dehydration. Wells were supposed to be safer, but many were dug too close to outhouses or animal pens. The groundwater would become contaminated and entire towns would get sick at once. Some settlements were abandoned because the water supply became so poisoned that everyone who drank it died. The irony is that whiskey was often safer to drink than water because the alcohol killed some of the bacteria. That's why saloons did such good business. People weren't just drinking to get drunk, they were drinking to stay alive. Speaking of staying alive, let's talk about something you probably take for granted every single day: going to the bathroom. Because in the Wild West, this simple act could literally kill you. Outhouses were the standard toilet, and they were exactly as terrible as you're imagining. A wooden shack built over a hole in the ground, usually located 50 to 100 feet from the main building. In summer, the smell was so bad you could taste it. Flies swarmed by the thousands, and sitting down meant exposing yourself to splinters, spiders, snakes, and sometimes scorpions that had crawled up from below. Toilet paper didn't exist. People used whatever was available: corn, cobs leaves, newspaper if you were lucky, or just their hand. The Sears catalog became known as the wish book, not just because you wished you could afford what was inside, but because those pages served a very practical purpose in the outhouse. Some families would tear out pages and hang them on a nail. The shiny pages didn't work as well, so those stayed in the catalog longer. But here's the truly horrifying part. Those outhouses contaminated everything around them. The waste would seep into the groundwater, poisoning wells and streams. Flies would land on the waste, then land on your food. Diseases like typhoid, dysentery, and cholera spread like wildfire because human waste was everywhere. In mining camps and cattle towns, there often weren't even outhouses. Men would just relieve themselves behind buildings or in alleys. The smell of these towns was legendary. Visitors described the stench as overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, animal manure, rotting garbage, and unwashed bodies. For cowboys on the trail, there were no outhouses at all. You'd walk away from camp, do your business, and hope a rattlesnake didn't bite you in a very unfortunate place. At night, it was even more dangerous. Men were bitten by snakes, stung by scorpions, or attacked by wild animals while answering nature's call. Some cowboys died this way, and their deaths were rarely talked about because of the embarrassment. Women had it even worse. Their long dresses and multiple layers of undergarments made using an outhouse a complicated and time-consuming ordeal. In winter, when temperatures dropped below zero, going to the outhouse could result in frostbite in places you really don't want frostbite. Some women used chamber pots inside, but then someone had to empty them, usually into a ditch or stream, further contaminating the water supply. By now, your stomach is turning and you're grateful for modern plumbing, but we're just getting started. Because if the food and sanitation didn't kill you, your job probably would. Work in the Wild West was backbreaking, dangerous, and often fatal. Most people worked 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, doing physical labor that would hospitalize modern workers within hours. Mining was one of the deadliest occupations. Gold and silver miners worked in tunnels that could collapse at any moment. Cave-ins killed hundreds of miners every year. Those who survived the cave-ins often died from silicosis, a lung disease caused by breathing rock dust. Miners would cough up blood and slowly suffocate as their lungs filled with scar tissue. There was no treatment, no compensation, and no one cared. If you died in the mine, they'd drag your body out and hire someone else the same day. Explosives were used to blast through rock, and accidents were common. Dynamite was unstable, especially in heat. It would sweat nitroglycerin, becoming so sensitive that a slight bump could set it off. Miners would be blown to pieces, their remains scattered across the tunnel. Some mining companies wouldn't even stop work to clean up the bodies. They'd just keep blasting and let the next shift deal with the mess. Railroad construction was equally deadly. Workers laid track in extreme heat and cold, often in remote locations with no medical care. Accidents with heavy equipment crushed limbs and skulls. Explosives used to clear paths through mountains killed workers regularly. Chinese immigrants, who made up a large portion of railroad workers, were given the most dangerous jobs and died at rates far higher than white workers. Some estimates suggest one worker died for every mile of track laid through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Cowboys had a reputation as tough, independent men, but their work was brutal, and the pay was terrible. A cattle drive could last 3 to 6 months, covering over 1,000 miles. Cowboys worked 18-hour days in the saddle in all weather for about $1 a day. They slept on the ground, ate terrible food, and dealt with stampedes, river crossings, and hostile encounters. Stampedes were particularly deadly. A herd of 2,000 cattle running in panic could trample a man and his horse into the ground. Cowboys caught in the stampedes were often found days later, their bodies so mangled they were barely recognizable. River crossings killed cowboys and cattle alike. Swollen rivers with strong currents would sweep away horses and riders. Some cowboys drowned, weighed down by their boots and heavy clothing. Others made it across but lost the cattle, which meant they didn't get paid. Ranchers didn't care if you nearly died doing your job. If you lost their cattle, you were fired and left stranded hundreds of miles from anywhere. Children worked too. Boys as young as 8 or 9 would work on ranches and mines or in factories. There were no child labor laws, no safety regulations, and no one to protect them. Children died in industrial accidents, were crippled by machinery, or simply worked themselves to death. A childhood in the Wild West meant hard labor, little education, and a short life expectancy. Even if you survived your job, you'd probably die from disease or injury because medical care in the Wild West was primitive at best and deadly at worst. Doctors were scarce, and many who claimed to be doctors had no training whatsoever. Anyone could hang a shingle and call themselves a physician. Some were competent, but many were quacks selling snake oil and performing procedures that killed more patients than they saved. A simple cut or scrape could kill you. Without understanding of germs or sterilization, infections were common and usually fatal. Gangrene would set in, turning flesh black and rotting. The only treatment was amputation, and that was done without anesthesia. You'd be held down by several strong men while a doctor sawed off your limb with a bone saw. The pain was so intense that many patients died from shock. Those who survived the amputation often died from infection afterward because the surgical tools weren't clean. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox swept through frontier towns regularly. Cholera could kill you in 24 hours. You'd be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. Entire families would be wiped out in days. Towns would lose 10 to 20% of their population during an outbreak. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Some towns just burned the bodies in mass graves because there weren't enough people left alive to dig individual graves. Smallpox was even worse. It killed about 30% of those infected and left survivors horribly scarred. Vaccination existed, but wasn't widely available in remote areas. Native Americans were devastated by smallpox, with some tribes losing 90% of their population. Settlers brought the disease, and it spread like wildfire through communities with no immunity. Snake bites were common and often fatal. Rattlesnakes, copperheads, and water moccasins were everywhere. The treatment for snakebite was to cut open the wound and try to suck out the venom, which didn't work and often made things worse. Some people would cauterize the bite with a red-hot knife, which was excruciating and ineffective. Most snakebite victims just died slowly over several days as the venom destroyed their tissue and shut down their organs. Dental problems were agonizing. There were no dentists in most frontier towns. If you had a toothache, you either lived with the pain or had someone pull the tooth with pliers. No numbing, no pain relief, just raw agony. Many people lost all their teeth by age 30. Abscessed teeth could lead to infections that spread to the brain and killed you. Something as simple as a cavity could be a death sentence. Medicine was mostly useless or actively harmful. Doctors prescribed mercury for everything from syphilis to constipation. Mercury poisoning caused tremors, kidney failure, and death. Opium and morphine were handed out freely for pain, creating widespread addiction. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was given to everyone, including children. People became addicted and died from overdoses regularly. If disease didn't kill you, violence probably would, because the Wild West had a justice system that was corrupt, brutal, and often non-existent. In many frontier towns, there was no law enforcement at all. Vigilante justice was the norm. If someone was accused of a crime, a mob would form and handle it themselves. Trials were rare. Hangings were common. Lynch mobs would grab a suspect, throw a rope over a tree branch, and execute them on the spot. Sometimes they got the right person, often they didn't. Public hangings were community events. Entire towns would gather to watch someone die. Children were brought along. Vendors sold food and drinks. It was entertainment. The condemned would stand on a platform with a noose around their neck while a preacher said a few words. Then the platform would drop, and they'd hang slowly, strangling to death. If they were lucky, their neck broke, and they died quickly. If not, they'd kick and struggle for several minutes while the crowd watched. Some towns had sheriffs or marshals, but many were corrupt. They'd take bribes, ignore crimes committed by wealthy citizens, and brutally enforce laws against the poor. Some lawmen were former outlaws themselves. The line between law enforcement and criminality was thin. Wyatt Earp, one of the most famous lawmen, was also a gambler pimp and accused murderer. His shootout at the OK Corral was less about justice and more about a personal feud. Gunfights did happen, but not like in the movies. There were no fair duels at high noon. Most shootings were ambushes, drunken brawls, or executions. Men were shot in the back, killed while sleeping, or gunned down in saloons. The famous gunfighters like Billy the Kid and Jesse James were murderers, not heroes. They killed for money, revenge, or just because they could. Saloons were incredibly dangerous places. Men would drink rot-gut whiskey that was often mixed with turpentine ammonia or gunpowder to give it more kick. This toxic brew would make men violent and unpredictable. Bar fights broke out constantly. Men would pull knives or guns over card games, insults, or nothing at all. Saloon floors were stained with blood. Bodies were dragged out and dumped in the street. The next day, the saloon would open for business as usual. Women in the West faced unique dangers. Prostitution was one of the few jobs available to women in frontier towns, and it was brutal. These women were exploited, abused, and often murdered. They died from disease, violence, and suicide at alarming rates. Domestic violence was common and rarely punished. A man could beat his wife and face no consequences. Women had few legal rights and no protection. Conflicts with Native Americans were brutal on both sides. The U.S. government waged a campaign of extermination against indigenous peoples. Entire villages were massacred, including women and children. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864 saw U.S. soldiers kill over 150 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women, children, and elderly. Soldiers mutilated the bodies and took body parts as trophies. Native Americans fought back with raids on settlements, and these could be equally brutal. Captives were sometimes tortured or killed. The violence was endless and horrific. Even if you somehow avoided violence, disease, and work accidents, daily life in the Wild West would break you mentally and physically. The environment was harsh beyond imagination. Summer temperatures in desert regions could reach 120 degrees. There was no air conditioning, no ice, no relief. People died from heat stroke regularly, water was scarce, and what water existed was often contaminated. Dehydration killed travelers who underestimated the distances between water sources. Winter was equally deadly. Blizzards would bury entire towns. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. People froze to death in their cabins when they ran out of firewood. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, noses, and ears. Some people went insane from the isolation and cold, walking out into blizzards and disappearing forever. Wild animals were a constant threat. Grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolf packs killed settlers and livestock. Rattlesnakes were everywhere. Scorpions hid in boots and bedding. Black widow spiders lurked in outhouses. Every day brought new dangers from the natural world. Hygiene was non-existent. Most people bathed once a month, if that. Lice and fleas were universal. Everyone had them. Clothing was rarely washed and worn until it fell apart. The smell of a frontier town was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, animal manure, rotting garbage, and human waste created a stench that modern people couldn't tolerate. Skin diseases were common. Rashes, boils, and infections covered people's bodies. There was no treatment, so you just lived with the discomfort and hoped it didn't kill you. Privacy didn't exist. Most families lived in 1 or 2 room cabins. Everyone slept in the same room. Personal space was a luxury no one could afford. In boarding houses and hotels, strangers shared beds. You'd pay for half a bed and sleep next to someone you'd never met. Bedbugs were so common that people just accepted them as part of life. You'd wake up covered in bites, and there was nothing you could do about it. Loneliness and isolation drove people mad. Homesteaders lived miles from their nearest neighbor. Weeks or months could pass without seeing another human being. The silence and emptiness of the frontier broke people psychologically. Suicide rates were high, especially among isolated settlers. Some people just gave up, unable to cope with the hardship and loneliness. Others turned to alcohol, drinking themselves to death on cheap whiskey. Alcoholism was epidemic. Whiskey was cheap and available everywhere. Men would drink to cope with the brutal conditions, the violence, and the hopelessness. Many became addicted and died from liver failure, alcohol poisoning, or accidents while drunk. Opium dens existed in many towns, offering another escape. Addiction destroyed lives and families, but no one cared. There was no treatment, no support, and no hope of recovery. The social hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. If you were poor, you stayed poor. If you were wealthy, you could literally get away with murder. Class divisions were stark. The rich lived in relative comfort while the poor struggled to survive. Racism was rampant and violent. Chinese immigrants were brutally exploited and often murdered. African Americans faced discrimination and violence. Mexican Americans were treated as second-class citizens in their own ancestral lands. Native Americans were systematically exterminated. By this point, You'd be desperately searching for a way back to your comfortable modern life with its antibiotics, indoor plumbing, human rights, and basic safety. The Wild West wasn't romantic or adventurous. It was a daily struggle for survival that most modern people couldn't endure for even 24 hours. The past may seem exciting in movies and books, but the reality was brutal, short, and often ended in a painful death. Those who survived weren't heroes. They were simply tough enough, lucky enough, or ruthless enough to make it through another day.